We live in a culture of unprecedented anxiety. 1 in 5 Canadians have reported ongoing high to extreme levels of anxiety. This is an epoch of time where all of the world's woes can be accessed immediately with a touch of a button. To exacerbate this, there are no longer trustworthy and reliable news sources. Gone are the days of Walter Cronkite and objectivity. Our children have lost their innocent years and have succumbed to the pressure of celebrity culture, where being famous takes precedence over character and inner peace. Big tech oligarchs filter and alter reality through algorithms and censorship that plays to their narrative. Suicide rates have spiked. There's violence in the streets. Protests. One echo chamber to another, fighting in the name of ideology. Where is the peace? Real peace, not merely the absence of conflict. Regardless of nationality, worldview, or socioeconomic status, we're all searching for peace and to be anchored. Today's guest has a book soon to be released entitled Jesus-Centered. Regardless of one's worldview, atheist, agnostic, Christian, or a host of other faiths and worldviews, there's something that we can all agree on. No one has been talked about more the past 2,000 years than Jesus Christ. Why is this? A radical always fighting for the underdog, born in squalor and dying a humiliating death. I don't want the title of this book to throw you off if you don't subscribe to a Christian worldview. This podcast is for anyone and everyone. The past year has been a catalyst or provocation, in a sense, to ask some better questions about life. Have you stopped to eliminate the noise, the commentary, the politics, and reevaluate the deeper, more meaningful, fleeting life that we have on this earth? What's up with this Jesus guy? Beyond what your family member tells you, beyond what the politics tell you, beyond what the church tells you, just him. Originally coined by John Duncan, then Watchman Nee, C.S. Lewis sums up our perception of Jesus in the following trilemma. I am here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now, it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. If this is correct, maybe our answer to peace isn't found in what others tell us, in what political stripe we are, in what a celebrity leader, professor, or pastor tells us. Maybe it's found in the much deeper well and recesses in the person of Jesus. Not the Jesus your sociology professor tells you, the hypocritical church leader tells you, the Hollywood actor tells you, not the moral teacher, the liar, the lunatic, but the one all the commentary doesn't tell you. Whatever your worldview, however long you have walked with or far from this Jesus, this episode is for you. Where is the anchor in the storm? Stay tuned as we discover this and much more in today's episode of the 6-8 Culture podcast. Welcome to the 6-8 Culture podcast, an international community where we share stories of transformation and restoration from the inside out, based on justice, kindness, and humility. Come journey with us. I'm your host, Rob McKinley. Today's guest has devoted his life to equipping leaders around the world as president of Arrow Leadership. He's a husband and father and has a passion to develop Jesus-centered leaders. Whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, we'll discover what this really means in this episode of the 6-8 Culture podcast. Communicating, coaching, and creating Jesus-centered resources are his heartbeat. He's the author of Leading Me, 8 Key Practices for a Christian Leader's Most Important Assignment, Great Questions for Leading Well, and free monthly e-resources at sharpeningleaders.com. His newest book, Jesus-Centered, will be out very soon. With experience in local church, denominational, parachurch, and marketplace roles, he's also earned degrees from Wilfrid Laurier University, Tyndale Seminary, and Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. In addition, he's thankful to be a graduate of the Arrow Leadership Program. Dr. Steve Brown, welcome to the 6-8 Culture podcast.
Rob, it's great to join you, and love the podcast and the focus on justice, kindness, and humility.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, and really great to have you join us as well. You and I had connected a number of years ago. I believe it was 2016, and that was for a cross-Canada Church Leaders Forum that we were doing with World Vision. And I might add very terrific insights that I gleaned from that. So thank you. Steve, you focus on Christian leadership development. There are many listeners out there that aren't Christians, yet really enjoy this podcast based on justice, kindness, and humility. Do you have any initial words that you'd first like to share with our audience before we progress in terms of relevance for those with differing worldviews?
I think justice, kindness, and humility are human callings for all of us, and the world is longing to see justice, to experience kindness, to see humility. And as we focus on the books titled Jesus-Centered, that was right up Jesus' alley in terms of justice, kindness, humility. When you think of Jesus, you should think of those words because he embodied them, he brought them. That was his heart, that was his vision. So I think that wherever we are, whatever we believe in, Jesus is a great model for us in these 3 key areas.
Okay, that's great. Before we get into the work of Arrow Leadership and your books, can we get to know a little bit about the man of Steve Brown? Where did you come from and what makes you tick?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I come from Ontario, so grew up near Toronto and spent a bunch of the first part of my life there. I've been on the West Coast now for 17 years. So I never imagined when you're in Toronto area, you kind of think it's the center of the universe. And but when you see the ocean and the mountains of the West Coast, yeah, you get pretty excited about that. So we've been on the West Coast for 17 years. I'm married to Lee. We're in our 24th year of marriage. I've got 3 teenagers at home, so 19, 17, and 15. When I'm not working, I love to run, outdoor stuff, exercise, reading. Yeah, love the chance to get to walk alongside amazing leaders from all over the world. So that's what I do at Arrow Leadership. I've been with Arrow for 17 years. The first 7 or 8 were as the program director, so developing leadership development programs, primarily for Christian leaders in the church or nonprofit world. And then the last 10, I've been the president, so overseeing the ministry in both Canada and the US.
Oh, what is something that you miss mostly about Ontario in comparison to living in BC right now?
You're going to get me in trouble here, Rob, in both places probably. The biggest thing is family. So we've missed lots of birthdays and special family things that happened in Ontario where both Lee and my family live. Our kids not being able to spend as much time with their cousins or extended family. So family's been the big draw to Ontario. Certainly not the Toronto Maple Leaf hockey team, although I've been a fan for many years.
Okay, sounds good. Steve, I want to get right into where we're living in this particular point of time in history in 2021. I was struck by something that Ann Voskamp recently wrote for the beginning of Lent. Not only timely for Lent, but with the news of Ravi Zacharias and how Christians are reevaluating their faith walk in this COVID environment. I'd like to read what she said. All celebrity has a responsibility to tear down pedestals, and all of us have a responsibility not to build any pedestals. Tear down our pedestals with daily transparency and vulnerability, lest we fall with pride. Celebrity has platforms to grow brands. Christianity has altars to come and die. Celebrity seeks visibility. Christianity seeks self-invisibility, so only Christ is visible through everything. Celebrity rises to be untouchable. Christianity kneels low to pour out for those mistreated as untouchables. Celebrity may have all the blue checks, but someday we will all tremble and stand before God for a character check. And the only hope for any of us will be the scarlet grace of Christ. We, the church, repent of raising up celebrities instead of celebrating in our Maker, who made all equally in the image of God. We turn from our idolizing ways to care more about the marginalized and poverty-stricken and the sacrificing ways of God. We, the church, repent of the way we have done church instead of humbly being the church. We turn from our dependence on microphones and big lights to share the message and turn toward serving in micro ways and being the light by sharing all that we have so that our very lives become the stronger message. As I was going through Arrow's website, it sounded like this is the type of leader and person you endeavor to foster. The purpose statement on your website says Arrow Leadership develops Christian leaders to be led more by Jesus, to lead more like Jesus, and lead more to Jesus. Let's chat a little about Arrow Leadership. For people who haven't heard of Arrow, what do you do there and why do you exist?
That was quite a poem or statement from Ann Voskamp, and I want to study that a bit more because it's just full of contrasts, right? Of the celebrity culture that we're in today, all around us. How many friends do you have? How many followers? How many retweets? How many posts and all the rest? And then the call of following Christ. And at Arrow Leadership, where I serve, our heartbeat is developing Jesus-centered leaders. By that, we mean leaders who are led more by Jesus, who lead more like Jesus, and who lead more to Jesus. And when you think about the example of Jesus, it's radical. It is in such contrast to a lot of what we see today in leadership and kind of what's celebrated in society. Jesus' radical example was one of humility rather than celebrity. Jesus didn't seek after celebrity at all. There's so much that resonates with the core of the podcast around humility we can talk more about. Jesus wasn't entitled. He didn't act entitled, even though he's God in flesh. He was obedient to what the Father wanted him to do. Jesus didn't come to be served. In our day and age, everyone thinks, I deserve, I'm due, I should be served. Why isn't this service good enough?
Yeah.
And Jesus got out a towel, got down on his knees, and washed the feet of his disciples, which was back then completely crazy, radical, that a leader would get down on his knees and touch the dirty feet of his followers was just unheard of. And it's also not seen very often today in any modern translation of what it would be like to wash somebody's feet. And he didn't seek personal gain. I mean, so much of our world is about what am I going to get and how fast can I get it? Jesus' whole heart was really to seek God's heart and to seek after God's priorities. So a very radical example of humility, obedience, the servant heart, service heart, and really seeking after God's bigger purposes than his own.
Yeah. Do you think it's more difficult in today's day and age than it would have been, say, 30 years ago, with the prevalence of social media now? As human beings, we always have these proclivities to seek after celebrities and the state of always wanting to worship something, but that grander narrative of we really are what we worship and we become what we worship. Is it more difficult in today's day and age to tear those altars of celebrity worship down than, say, it would have been a few decades ago?
Yeah, I know that back in Jesus' day, pride was really a positive value. And this idea of humility was craziness, especially from a leader. That wasn't what people were looking for from a leader or from a God. So back then, 2,000 years ago to now, I don't know if there's been ups and downs, ebbs and flows. I'd love to ask a historian a little bit more about that, but we're definitely in a day today where we're drawn to celebrity. I mean, look at the reality shows on TV. You can just see by the number of followers that somebody has on Instagram who's important today. Yeah. And it's celebrities, and they have great power, and some of them steward that wisely and well and for greater good, and some of them don't. But I think Jesus just gives us this crazy, radical, different approach to life and leadership.
He does. And I think that none of us are immune from celebrity culture. Full disclosure with me, Ravi Zacharias was somebody who was very instrumental developmentally in my earlier stages of my relationship with Christ. I usually will not read many writings or watch many sermons or lectures from those whose name is associated with their ministry. John Doe Ministries kind of thing. I've just found in my experience that's usually an indicator, not in all ways, but in many instances, that there's often discord associated with those ministries. For some reason, I gave this a pass. Now, I'm not saying that those writings aren't valuable to the kingdom. They definitely are. But within my own heart is what I'm speaking, is that I had a sense of celebrity culture. And this has been a very good heart check for me on where my identity and soul influence and the well that I drink from comes from. And that's been a very sobering lesson for me, and I think for potentially millions of other people during this really difficult time.
Yeah, I think that Christian leaders need to be held to a higher account. That's in the Bible, that Christian leaders are supposed to be above reproach. So people should be able to expect that and trust that. And unfortunately, too many other examples have shown sin and wrong that's really been devastating to many, many people, women particularly in this case, and people who are vulnerable. And it's gutting to just imagine the impact. And it's one where I think we need to lament the pain that's been caused, and we need to repair where we're able to. It's gutting, and the church should be leading the way. We have too many examples too often where we're not. For that, we need to lament and repair and do things differently.
Very well said. Yeah. And that Lent devotional from Ann Voskamp was very telling and very timely for what we're going through right now. We're listening to author and president of Arrow Leadership, Dr. Steve Brown. Stay with us as we hear about Steve's soon-to-be-released book entitled Jesus-Centered. We get to hear why he chose Jesus of all people to write about, and he explains how Jesus is the ultimate model of servant leadership and change in a desperately troubled world. Steve, you're the author of 2 books, monthly resources, and you have a 3rd book coming out very soon entitled Jesus-Centered. A subject that's always timely given the fragility of the state of the world, and again, I might reiterate, especially timely right now. In this book, there are many endorsements by internationally respected leaders. I'll read a few of them. Leighton Ford said he eagerly welcomes and highly recommends this book. May it be widely read and practiced. Dr. Carson Pugh lauds the importance of grounding. He says, I believe that the first thing a leader must do to make decisions, or at least the right decisions, is to get grounded. Steve Brown has written a sage book for us all, encouraging us to stay grounded on Jesus. Being Jesus-centered matters whether you are leading in your neighborhood, work, home, school, or country. Steve's experience mentoring leaders worldwide, combined with his clear articulation, make Jesus-centered an excellent encouragement to stay grounded. I worked with and for Michael Messenger, the president and CEO of World Vision, for many years. He said, during this season of uncertainty, how do we replace fear with faith, distraction with focus, and the question, why now, with what's next? Through this insightful book, Steve shares how the answer is Jesus. If you want to cultivate a renewed wonder at who Jesus is, how he led, and how we can deepen our engagement with him in our life and leadership, this book is a gift. Now, I was able to give a cursory reading and simply became enamored within its pages, really looking forward to digging deeply into it, along with the many reflection questions that are included. Steve, why pick Jesus of all the people you could write about? You could have written about anything and anyone. I would have accepted, just saying. But why Jesus?
Yeah, when you think about all the people in history, there's nobody like Jesus. He lived different and he led different. There's a great quote by a pastor named John Stott, and he says this: "We talk about Charles the Great, Alexander the Great, Napoleon the Great, but not Jesus the Great. He is not the great, he is the only. There's nobody like him. He has no rival and no successor." Jesus is set apart. That's really why I wanted to focus on him. There's nobody like him. There's nobody more trustworthy to follow after. He lived well. He finished well. His heart for seeing change in the world is inspirational, and his life is one we can follow after and model our own lives after. So I sometimes think we get so familiar with Jesus that we lose our awe of him. Or we just dismiss him for other reasons. Maybe we've had some bumps in the church or not enjoyed Christian people maybe, but Jesus is, I think, one who we can hold in awe and follow after. So that's really the heartbeat of the book, is to stir a fresh awe of Jesus, because when we have an awe of Jesus, we'll be drawn toward him. And when we're drawn toward him, we'll be transformed by him. And then other people, as we're transformed by him, will be drawn to him. So that's really the heartbeat behind the book.
That's great. There's 3 parts in there: being led more by Jesus, living and leading more like Jesus, and leading more to Jesus. So if we can start at the beginning, maybe why you wrote it and what both Christians and people of varying worldviews might be able to expect from it.
Jesus gave the invitation to many people, come follow me. And that's really the heartbeat behind being led more by Jesus, is that we're followers first, and we're following after Jesus. A lot of us are following after something or someone. We're chasing after something or someone. And I believe that if we follow after Jesus, there's nobody better to follow after. This idea of being led more by Jesus is that we're followers. There is a cost to that, and we don't want to minimize it. Jesus says, take up your cross daily and follow after me. There's this cost of surrender. And can I actually trust Jesus? Can I surrender my heart and will and desires to how he's guiding me and leading me? And I think the answer is yes. And Jesus says that if you do that, you're actually going to be way better off. You're actually going to gain your life back. You surrender it, but you actually gain it back. And so that's really the heartbeat behind being led more by Jesus.
And within those pages, in being led more by Jesus, a few things really came to light for me as I was going through that. I think many people, both Christians and those of other worldviews, don't fully understand the enormity of God's love. We all stumble in this area. Now, you wrote the following: without a deep personal connection with God's love, I was seeking to serve out of a reservoir that had no refill point. I often wondered if I had done enough, so I would push myself to do more. I kept trying to earn my way to God, and I always ended up feeling as though I had fallen short. Eventually, I recognized I was also doing and serving solo. I was consumed with doing things for God. Notice I write for God, not with God. In trying to do things for God, I was working on my own. In my mind, God was separate from my doing. He was like a spectator and judge on the outside. That mindset made doing and serving pretty lonely work. God seemed distant, even though I was the one who had intentionally gone off on my own. I didn't understand that God desired to be with me, even when I wasn't doing and serving. Steve, what would you say to people who say they don't need religion to lead well or to live well?
All of us, I think, need to be grounded in something in order to have principles by which we live and by which we lead. So where are you getting your principles from? Where are you grounded? And you could say, well, I'm grounded in myself, or I'm grounded in, what's the loving thing to do? Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life. Those are very conclusive statements. He didn't say he was kind of one way of many. He said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So it's pretty bold what he put out there. And that's why it's challenging to go, yes, I agree with that. But in terms of just leadership, when you think about Jesus, he's got a lot to offer in terms of how he led. Do people today, would they respect a leader who has great integrity? Would people today respect a leader who is a servant leader, who serves other people rather than themselves? Would people today respect a leader who has vision vision not to make a quick buck, but to see the world change. Jesus had a huge vision that continues on 2,000 years later. Would people today like a leader who pours into them? Jesus was all those things. He poured into the disciples. He had a vision to see the world change. He served as he led. He modeled and he lived a life of integrity. I could keep going, but Jesus has this radical example, this exemplary track record. So I think he brings a lot to leadership conversation any way you come at it from any perspective.
Yeah, yeah. And as I was reading that, I was asking a question. What would some major inhibitors to being led by Jesus in our world look like today? And for myself, I was thinking, okay, well, pride, affluence, even though we're going through this pandemic, there's still a social safety net for the majority of Canadians. What other inhibitors are there that prevent people from being led by Jesus?
My biggest inhibitor is me, I think, because inside me, I want to do my own thing. And Jesus says, follow me, not yourself. I like sometimes to follow other people because maybe they're popular or they're successful or they're really smart. And Jesus says, follow me. So we have this challenge inside us. Do I trust Jesus? Do I trust him enough to follow after him in the big things of life, in the moment by moment things of life? And I'm captured really by Jesus's vision. When you think about Jesus in Luke chapter 4, he reads this scroll to the congregation. It's words that were written hundreds of years before. And he reads these words from Isaiah, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolls up the scroll, gives it back to the person that gave it to him, sits down, and then he says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And by that he was saying, I'm the one who's bringing this mission, this vision, to proclaim good news, to free prisoners, to give sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the Lord's favor, the Lord's blessing. That's the vision that Jesus cast then, and that's the one that we're to follow after. And that is a compelling vision to me, to see our world in a different way, to see that there's possibility to change it. And that gets me fired up as I think about Jesus' heart and how he lived that, and then how he carries it on through his people today.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think so many of us, though, we have this feeling of inadequacy, that we're not that leader. In your chapter in this section on grounding, you state, the first step to embracing your true identity is to focus on God, not yourself. So let's test this out. Try to fill in the blank. I'm not blank enough. And I think almost all of us can identify in one of these categories. I'm not old/young enough. I'm not wise/educated enough. I'm not good looking enough. I'm not experienced or skilled enough. I'm not extroverted enough. I'm not good or pure enough. I'm not strong or courageous enough. Now, this is really just the age-old conundrum. Our focus seems to drift to ourselves far too much. And there's some great wisdom that you follow up with here. Do you have some insight on this particular struggle, I think, that so many of us have?
Yeah, it's not hard for me to fill in the blank, and I'm sure it's not hard for many people, because we can always see our shortcomings and we can dwell on them and fixate on them. I remember the story of Exodus chapter 3, Moses, and he sees this burning bush that's not kind of burning up, and it actually speaks. So it's a pretty strange deal, a burning bush that doesn't burn up, that speaks, that calls him over. So he's pretty freaked out about it. Through this bush, God is speaking to him, and God is revealing that he's heard the cries of his people, the Israelites, and they're under the oppression, they're in slavery from the Egyptians. And God tells Moses, I've heard their cries and I want to free them. I want to bring them to a better place, to the promised land. I mean, it's a beautiful picture of God's heart for people and his people, the Israelites. And then God says, and Moses, I want you to be the one that leads them out. I want you, in a sense, to face down Pharaoh. And Moses responds and he says, but who am I? In a sense, he was beginning to fill in the blank. I'm not blank enough. And he had stuff in his life and resume that wasn't the best. I mean, He wasn't really an Israelite because he grew up in Pharaoh's household. He wasn't really an Egyptian because he was an Israelite by birth. He was a fugitive wanted by the government because he killed a guy. He's a sheep herder, like he's a shepherd. So he's not like kind of a military strategist at this point. They're not even his own sheep. So he's doing his father-in-law's sheep. He's not even wealthy on his own. He's like, who am I?
He was asked to speak and he was not eloquent of speech, or some said he was a stutterer as well.
So his resume is not beautiful, right? And he's going to God, I think you got the wrong guy here. And God responds back with this beautiful statement, I will be with you. And Moses is like, yeah, but, who am I to say has sent me? Because he didn't really like hearing that. And God goes back to it and goes, tell them I am is the one who sent you. God was saying to Moses, in a sense, get your eyes off yourself and off your resume, because it's got some holes in it. And remember that I am with you. What I have called you to, I am with you in. And that's the difference maker. I think the idea of Christmas, really, we sing, O Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. This idea that we're not supposed to go do something great for God. We're not to try and imitate God or Jesus. God is with us, empowering us and changing us from the inside out. And that's the big difference maker as we depend on God, and God is at work in us and through us through his Holy Spirit. So that's the big difference maker there.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think societally and a lot of us individually have it backwards, because we think that focusing on ourselves first is the first step. But the first step to embracing your true identity is to focus on God, not on yourself. Great takeaway there, Steve. The book More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell was instrumental for me when I first came to know this Jesus we're speaking of. You mentioned that you did an internship with Josh McDowell. What was that like?
Yeah, my first introduction to Josh McDowell, Christian speaker, travels around the world, speaks a lot to youth and college students. My first introduction to him was through a book. Some friends gave me a couple of his books, and they had the questions I had about faith with answers that seemed well thought out and believable. And those books were a real help to me to wrestle through, is Jesus really the way, the truth, and the life or not? Was Jesus really real? So those books were really helpful for me. And I went off to university after a summer of reading Josh's books as a new follower of Jesus. And I went to business school and got through the end of business school. And I was like, what am I supposed to do now? And a lot of my friends were getting corporate jobs, jumping on the corporate ladder. And I had just this sense in me, I'd like to learn more about youth ministry and apologetics. And apologetics is a fancy term for the defense of the Christian faith. I didn't know where to go to even learn that stuff. So I wrote, as maybe only a 22-year-old could do. I wrote to Josh McDowell and I said, is there any way I could spend time with you and learn what you do and how to do it better in my own life? So I found out he had an internship program. So I packed up and moved to the States for a year and got to travel the world with him, really helping with administrative things or communications or driving or transportation arrangements. And I got to really see him up close. And I was blessed to see God doing amazing things all over the world. I was blessed to see a spiritual hunger that all over the world, people, when they heard about Jesus, there's a lot of people that wanted that. I learned about defending the faith and speaking in youth ministry. But the biggest thing for me, honestly, was watching Josh love his wife and spend time with his kids. My family broke apart when I was 11 years old, and that was very difficult and had been for many years. So I needed to see a family that worked and a marriage that was working, and I got to see that up close. And every day, literally, I'm so thankful in my marriage to leave Dad to Luke, Ainsley, and Lauren, to look back and go, that was my biggest takeaway. It's funny because that wasn't even on my list of like, these are the things I want to learn about, but God blessed me with a great role model to watch.
That's a great story. Those blessings that come by unforeseen ways that we never expect are often the most treasured. When we move into the next section on living and leading more like Jesus, you speak about thinking like Jesus. Feed your mind, filter your mind, focus your mind. Can you expand a bit on this?
Our minds are incredibly complex and important. What we think and how we think impacts how we live and how we lead. So what goes on in your mind impacts your everyday. If we're not intentional about that, we're just going to take in a lot of stuff that's going to point our minds and get our minds going in directions that aren't going to help how we live and how we lead. So having the mindset of Christ is something the Bible talks about. Having the mind of Christ. And Jesus was, I believe, the world's greatest thinker. His mind was sharper than anybody else's. And really looking for how do I cultivate the mindset of Christ is incredibly important. And how Jesus fed his mind. So he fed his mind through scripture. He had to deal with thoughts in his mind that he needed to shut down. So I'm a runner, Rob, and when you think about doing a half marathon or a marathon, you got a lot of miles to think through. You just got to keep going, right? And I remember doing a half marathon and I was 2/3 in and my legs felt like lead for some reason. Sometimes it happens when you run and you train, but still on the day of, you kind of feel horrible. And people were passing me by, and people who I thought were like much slower than me or much less in shape than me were passing me by. And I started to think in my head, Steve, you didn't train hard enough. You shouldn't be here. You should just stop, take the golf cart back to the finish line. Just throw in the towel. And when you let thoughts start to take hold in your mind, they can really sabotage you.
Yeah.
And for a runner, you can end up just stopping and quitting. But if you apply that to life, it's the same thing. If you get thoughts in there that just aren't healthy, aren't positive, aren't good, they will take you down. So I recognized in my run that I needed to shut down those thoughts. So I refocused. I focused on the finish line, imagining my family there cheering me on. I imagined the food tent. I imagined a hot shower. I imagined, a comfortable couch to lie out on. And I had to take captive those thoughts. And that's what scripture says, to take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Because we have, with God's strength and God's power, the ability to say no to what's going on in our head.
Yeah.
It's not easy. It's a discipline. We need God's help. That's just part of what I'm talking about, our thinking and filtering stuff. There's so much junk out there and so much negativity out there. Rummaging around in our head isn't going to be helpful. We got to get rid of it. So that's a little bit about what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's great. It's still within this section of living and leading more like Jesus. We live in a culture of protest, of outrage, of social media reaction. And you speak in this section about serving and responding like Jesus. These are two areas that are really grossly lacking in our culture of narcissism, echo chambers, and reaction. What imagery of serving and responding like Jesus can we take away?
Yeah, if you think of who Jesus was and is, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, creator, sustainer, yet he served. It's just mind-blowing. He says that I didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. That's radical. So many ways Jesus served. He healed, he fed the hungry, he healed the sick, he rebuked those often who are the religious authorities and the people of power. He stood up and spoke truth in the midst of that. So Jesus' response of serving is seeking the better for someone else when there's no necessary gain for yourself. Oftentimes it's like, what's in this for me? And Jesus didn't do that. He saw, how can I bless people? How can I help people? Even if I'm not going to get a direct benefit from it. And that's pretty countercultural, really, isn't it?
It is. Unreciprocated love is something that's not easy to find.
No, it's not. I know the podcast is about humility, and the humility of Jesus is just off the charts. If you thought of hosting the launch of a Marvel movie, we'd go to Hollywood, this amazing place. There'd be strobe lights and red carpets and limousines, and there'd be fancy and powerful people everywhere if we did it right. And then you look at Jesus. He enters into the world as an ovum, as this little tiny microscopic egg. He's given under the care of earthly caretakers who are simple people, teenagers in a backwater place of an oppressed people. He's given a name that's not like a one-name celebrity. He's given a name that's a very common name in his day. He's not given a silver spoon. He actually works a day's work. Even though he's the creator of everything, he's working. He doesn't travel by limo or helicopter. He's on foot or on a donkey. His base of operations is not some fancy compound somewhere. He's on the road. He's on the move. His entourage aren't the brightest and sharpest, most powerful people in the world. They're these ragtag bunch of 12 disciples who probably caused him a lot of headaches. He spent time with them and they weren't leveraging their power anywhere because they didn't really have any power. Self-promotional, Jesus wasn't. He would often tell people, don't say what I just did, because he didn't want to either have crowds overwhelm him or to get on the wrong side of the authorities before his time.
Right.
I mean, even his death is just this humiliating public spectacle. You know, when a celebrity dies today, the amazing flowers and all the rest that happens, everybody deserted Jesus and fled because they were afraid to even be known as being a friend of his. So radical humility, that just makes me pause and one, want to embrace that, and one, want to have more of that in my own life.
Oh, for sure. And what you help to do in your book is equip people on getting there. So you have a section entitled Finding Rhythms, and it begins like this: frazzled, frenetic, frayed, fatigued, fog. There you've just described most of Western society. One book that was initially formative for me was Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline. And another one of my favorites is our mutual friend Mark Buchanan's Spiritual Rhythm. And I just love the content in this section. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? All these F words: frazzled, frenetic, frayed, fatigued, fog. So many of us are feeling this, especially now. Can you expand on this a bit, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, especially pre-COVID. COVID maybe has slowed down things for a lot of us, but a 24/7, 365, always on, always connected world. People go on vacation and they're still dealing with emails from work, from the beach. This always on, 365, 24/7 world, it just breeds frazzled, frenetic, frayed, fatigued, fog. And Jesus lived in a day and had a ministry that was pretty intense. He did things, long days, helping crowds and crowds of people wanting things from him all the time, expecting things from him, lots of noise and confusion and chaos all around him. I think we can all relate to that. But what Jesus did time and time again was he pulled away. He pulled out of that fray, another F word there, and he pulled away and spent time with the Father and the Spirit. And he rested, he reflected, he restored, he refocused. And that's something I think that's missing, because Jesus had this rhythm of fully engage and then withdraw and rest, pray, reflect, retool, refocus, and then fully engage again. Back and forth, back and forth. And our society's taken on Aesop's fable, if you remember the old children's fable.
Yeah, very much, yeah.
You know, the tortoise and the hare. The story goes, the moral of the story is slow and steady wins the race. Well, science actually contradicts that. Science says that the hare, who, went to sleep because he knew he could beat the tortoise, he just slept for too long. The idea of going hard and then pausing and resting and then going hard and pausing and resting is actually what science says we're built for. That's why God has designed rhythms in creation. That's why we have day and we have night. Why he said we should have a Sabbath every 7 days. So there's this on and off, and Jesus modeled that very well. And I think we need to have rhythms, spiritual rhythms, physical rhythms, work rhythms, where we restore and refresh on a regular basis.
As we move on to the third section, leading more to Jesus. In this section, you talk about everyone having an important role in God's upside-down kingdom, where there are no second-class citizens. Be a kingdom seeker. This is very counterintuitive and flies in the face of many worldviews, caste systems, survival of the fittest, these kinds of things. Can you expand on what you mean in this section?
Jesus said to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. So that's what I mean by being a kingdom seeker. And Leighton Ford talked about being a kingdom seeker, seeking God's kingdom, his purposes, his priorities, rather than being an empire builder. And there's lots of organizations and people who want to build something for themselves. But as you follow Christ, we're called to seek his kingdom. What are his purposes and his priorities? And everybody is invited. Everybody's invited to be part of it. Sometimes we think, well, my pastor, he's the one who's seeking God's work, and I'm working at a factory somewhere, so I'm in a different space. In God's kingdom, it says everybody's designed to be part of God's purposes in changing this world, in bringing God's love to this world, of bringing God's hope to this world, bringing God's justice to this world. If we catch God's heart, we can all be part of that. And that's what I'm talking about God's upside down kingdom, because it's counterintuitive, because we think that this is about professionals, the pastor or the specialist or somebody who's got a title. I read somewhere something along the lines of God delights in well-made chairs. And I believe that if you're a carpenter, as Jesus was, God delights in a chair. I'm sitting on one, you're sitting on one, Rob. We want those things to work and to be comfortable. And sometimes we think, who made this chair? While they made that chair, they were making a difference, a positive difference in the world. That's something that brings delight to God.
Yeah.
God loves well-made chairs. He loves well-researched sermons. I think he likes shorter ones rather than longer ones, but just like everybody else. But I think all of us have a role to play. I go for runs and walks, and I see those rocks been made during COVID season. They're hand painted and they're kind of stuck in crazy spots sometimes, just giving a little word of hope. Sometimes they're painted by children. And I think that's something God delights in, of bringing life and hope to the world.
Yeah.
In even a very small way. That's something we can be part of. Being a business owner that pays people with a fair and living wage, who takes creation care seriously, brings delight to God.
Yeah.
Posting on social media something that's actually going to bring life and light and hope rather than more darkness and more negativity. Those are all simple, practical ways that anybody can participate in God's mission in the world.
Yeah, and then continuing on that, you speak about building bridges and seeing people. You mentioned this morbidly dark yet mildly humorous car commercial where a woman chooses her car first over potentially saving a life. Have people become more invisible than ever, or have we been like that for some time?
I think it's more now than ever. It's hard to actually find people in my neighborhood sometimes because they drive right into their garage and shut the door behind them and they're gone. Or in your apartment building, you might see them in the elevator, but then they're gone. And people working different hours and just different schedules. I mean, COVID has kind of magnified this. I'm even afraid to be around people. The wonderful thing about Jesus was that he could be in a crowd of people. And I would look at the crowd and I wouldn't see individuals, but every face Jesus looked at, he saw the person. He would be in a crowd and he'd see somebody up in a tree. There's this guy named Zacchaeus, the Bible talks about, this tax collector who was up in a tree so he could get a good vantage point of Jesus. And Jesus had crowds all around him and noise and chaos all around him, but he saw Zacchaeus up in the tree. And he saw his heart. Zacchaeus was wanting to connect with Jesus in some way, and that's why he was up the tree. And Jesus said, I want to spend time with you. Come on down and let's have a meal together. That's the delight of Jesus, being God in flesh, but wanting to spend time with us. And that's a little hard to comprehend. Why would the God of the universe want to spend time with me? Does God even recognize I'm alive or care about that I'm alive or want to spend time with me rather than squash me? And the answer is, yes, God knows I'm alive because he was intimately involved in my creation. He sees me. He wants to be with me and wants me to be with him. And he wants to spend time with me. And it's so fun. Jesus lavished time on people. And most of that outside of his time with his disciples was with people who wouldn't say that they were followers of his. He just enjoyed being with people and connecting with their hearts and their hopes and their hurts.
Yeah, as you're speaking, it's bringing up the imagery of what you were saying about that we're both sitting on a chair, and artist and creator who's created that chair and takes pride in their craftsmanship. It's the same how God created us and takes pride in a deep, intimate knowledge in who we are. Steve, I've said it before on this podcast, justice and mercy cannot coexist without the humility of the cross. We have a culture screaming for justice and wrongs perpetrated against us. We beg for mercy if we are the said perpetrators, yet only through true humility can we even begin to understand their interplay. Your book, Jesus Centered, is a crucial read at this time of history and gets straight to the heart of what it means to live out a 6-8 culture. Not only for Christians, but also for truth seekers and anyone remotely interested in personal transformation as much as in global transformation. Here's the crux. We won't see global transformation until we're first changed from the inside out. This book is definitely a catalyst for that beautiful journey. Now, you've touched on it earlier, but can we expand a little bit more on this humility of Jesus? What does it mean for us as individuals, and what can that look like for our world?
God hates pride. He says that in lots of different places in Proverbs in the Old Testament. He detests it. He hates it.
Yeah.
When we center our lives on ourselves, that's the heart of pride. Jesus calls us to center our lives on Him. And that requires some humility for us to do that, to say, my way is not the best way. My way's actually not the best way. Jesus' way is the best way. Jesus is the one I need to follow, not myself or anybody else or anything else. Yeah. And the way of humility is the way of the kingdom of heaven. Boasts of accomplishment and self-sufficiency are not the way of the kingdom of heaven. Wielding privilege and protecting position and leveraging power for our own gain are not the ways of the kingdom of heaven. At the cross, as you mentioned, we see Jesus lays down his life out of love for us, despite the fact that he's done nothing wrong. You think about Jesus, he never walked into a room where he wasn't the smartest, holiest, or most powerful person in that room. He was never in a room where he wasn't the smartest, holiest, or most powerful person, yet he did not come off like that. He came off as one who would serve, one who would love, one who would bless. That's the Jesus that I get excited about, learning about, following, and that's who the book's about.
They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again with the expectation of a different result. Our society and culture is seeing unprecedented levels of anxiety and depression. So we need to be doing things a different way. And I would encourage anyone listening to this podcast to take that step out and purchase Steve's book. Steve, how can people purchase this book, Jesus Centered, that you've just written?
Our website is arrowleadership.org. And it's just like a arrow, ARROW, leadership.org. So we've got a store that you can buy Jesus Centered on. You can also go to Amazon and order. Our pre-orders start mid-March. It'll officially launch April 13th. And it's a great book you could read with a group or with your team. And there's discussion questions where you can talk about what you're learning together. So it's a great tool to help stir a conversation around what's it mean to be centered on Jesus or to be Jesus-centered.
I'm really excited about digging really deeply into this book. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
I just love the podcast and grateful to be part of it and love the focus of what you're doing, Rob. So thanks for having me on and thanks for this opportunity to be with your listeners.
We've been listening to author and president and CEO of Arrow Leadership, Dr. Steve Brown. Thanks for sharing your time with the 6-8 Culture podcast, where we share stories of personal transformation that are making our world a more just, kind, and humble place. Join us for our next session of impacting stories with 6-8 Culture. This is Rob McKinley signing out with a reminder for us all to act justly, to be kind, and to walk humbly.